Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to joining us right now. We'll begin shortly. We'll give everyone a couple minutes, 1 or 2 minutes to join and get on. Good afternoon to those joining us right now. We'll begin in about a minute or two, so we're waiting for everyone to sign up. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll begin and more people will be joining us. But good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program. If this is your first time coming to our events, we welcome you and we hope you visit our website so you can stay informed of our upcoming events for the rest of our spring semester. My name is Bora and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. A little bit about how today is going to go. I will introduce our commentator and our moderator, then our moderator will introduce both our speakers. After our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderated discussion followed by Q&A. Please enter your questions for our moderator to answer in the Q&A function. In the chat, just if you have any comments, please use that, but try to keep all the questions in the Q&A. So it's my pleasure to introduce our commentator, Jim Hollifield. He is the Academic Director of the Tower Center. Our moderator is Ashton Woods. She is a senior majoring in mechanical engineering with a minor in law and legal reasoning. She is a member of the SMU Women's Track and Field Team, a co-founder and vice president of the Black Student Athlete Committee, as well as representative to the Black Unity Forum. She's also a president scholar at SMU. She will be attending law school to study patent law in the fall. So Ashton, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Bora. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we are lucky enough to be hearing from Danielle Lemi and Nadia Brown. Danielle Lemi is a fellow of the SMU Tower Center. Danielle is a scholar of representation in American politics with a focus on identity, race, and gender. She uses experimental and elite interview methods to apply theoretical frameworks of identity and group behavior to questions of voter behavior and legislative politics. With Dr. Nadia E. Brown, she is the co-author of Sister Style, The Politics of Appearance for Black Women Political Elites, Oxford University Press. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the APSA Latino Scholarship Fund, and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. We will also be hearing from Nadia Brown, who is an associate professor of political science at Purdue University. She specializes in Black women's politics and holds a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies. Dr. Brown's research interests lie broadly in identity politics, legislative studies, and Black women's studies. While trained as a political scientist, her scholarship on intersectionality seeks to push beyond disciplinary constraints to think more holistically about the politics of identity. With that, I will hand it over to them to show us their presentation.
All right, can you see it? We're all good?
Yes.
Awesome, take it away, Nadia.
Okay, well, on behalf of Danielle and myself, we want to thank Southern Methodist University, Jim Holyfield, as well as the Tower Center for having us. We are deeply indebted to their support and their encouragement through this book process along the way, particularly in the support they've done for Danielle, which enabled us to produce this book. So we're going to talk to you today about our book, Sister Style, The Politics of Appearance for Black Women Political Elites. And we're open to all sorts of questions about how this book came about, how this co-authorship happened, and some of like the behind the scenes, kind of how the sausage is made kind of questions. Next slide, Danielle. So we start from the premise that not all Black women political elites are the same. Now, this might seem intuitive, but for political science, this is not, right? And so imagine in most of the work that we do in political science, Black women are lumped in one category of analysis, usually to compare them to Black men, white women, white men, Latinx women and men, Asian American women and men, and so forth. Very rarely do we see intergroup differences among Black women, primarily because they tend to vote the same. Most Black women are a part of the Democratic Party. They vote for the Democrats at high and overwhelming rates. And so for many political scientists, there's no there to figure out what's going on with Black women. But Danielle and I take seriously that there are different lived experiences and different political outcomes because of Black women's differences. And this is the work that we do in this book. So this picture here on your left is of Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams ran for governor in 2018. She went on The Breakfast Club, which is a syndicated talk show, urban radio show based out of New York City, and said that she's not seen as a viable candidate. She's dark-skinned, heavy-set, she's unmarried, has natural hair. The co-hosts of the show kind of laughed that off and said, whoa, you are qualified, right? You're the most qualified person in the race. And Stacey Abrams agreed, right? She is a graduate of Spelman University, a law Yale graduate. She's also was the minority leader in the Georgia State legislature, and was really instrumental in making sure that democratic ideals were happening in that legislature during extreme Republican control. Compare and contrast this to Kamala Harris. So in 2013, when she was serving as state's attorney general in California at a private fundraiser, Barack Obama famously said that she is the most attractive state's attorney general. And everybody kind of laughed, and she thanked him, and Barack Obama went on to carry out his fundraising speech. When the comments leaked to the public, feminists and women's activists were pretty up in arms, and they chastised the former president for calling attention to Kamala Harris's looks as opposed to her qualifications and the job that she was doing as state's attorney general. President Obama called her up and said, "I apologize for calling you attractive," and everyone just kind of laughed. But these are two perfect examples of how these women are treated differently. And both of these laughters, right? No one has questioned whether Stacey Abrams was competent. No one questioned whether Kamala Harris was attractive. But would the shoe fit on the other foot? And this is the kind of question that we take seriously in this book. Kamala Harris is the daughter of immigrants from Jamaica and South India. Stacey Abrams is the daughter of sharecroppers that were from a lineage of formerly enslaved folks in Mississippi. She has dark skin, curly textured hair. Kamala Harris has lighter skin and longer or flowing hair. And so we take these 2 points of examples to show that while these women are now achieving great heights, right? Kamala Harris is the vice president. Stacey Abrams is largely seen as a kingmaker in Democratic politics, given her role in helping to turn Georgia blue for this 2020 election, that we're still drawn back to the differences in how people perceive them based on what they look like. Next slide, Danielle. So what we do is this deep dive into a beautiful intersectional mess. And I take this title, or this play on a title, from Wendy Smooth's 2006 article, Intersectionality is a Mess Worth Making. And what Danielle and I argue, that this is a beautiful mess, right? That we should really, in political scientists, mess with all the grays, right? We don't need to look at things as either black or white, up or down, right? Left or right, but instead sit in this messy uncomfortability and figure out, right, how in the intersectional analysis helps us to understand Black women's politics more deeply. And for us, phenotype is a way that we can understand how Black women experience politics and how they act as political actors. Next slide. So why do we study Black women's hair? I've gotten a couple of hate mail and some angry tweets, and perhaps Danielle has had too, from people who say there's so many, pressing issues that are going on in the world right now. Why in the world are you studying hair? This has nothing to do with politics. Indeed, the first time I wrote about Black women's hair, I got rejected from a journal because they said it's because it happens to political elites doesn't mean that it's political. And instead, what Danielle and I show is that hair is deeply political. So why do we study Black women's hair? Well, first, we know that hair has political implications for people, and particularly for legislators. And so I do a thought experiment in my class, and I ask people to close their eyes, and in their mind, if we say the word Afro, what immediately comes to mind? And for most folks, it's Angela Davis in the 1970s with an Afro and symbolizing Black Power movements. If I ask people to think about hairstyle of dreadlocks or locks, most of them think about Bob Marley and Rastafarian connections. And these things, right, are tied to politics. But fast forward now that these hairstyles are less politicized, they're still tied to political implications or political connotations and heuristics for folks. But for Black women, it means something even deeper. So we know from sociological literature, from anthropological literature, as well as women's studies and African American studies, that women who have straighter hair and lighter skin, or the ability to straighten their hair, are more likely to achieve economic mobility. That might mean educational attainment, marrying up, or being able to be parts of social strata that they were previously excluded from. We also know that Black women have been punished based on their hair, or hair has been used against them as a punishment. So African American women historians have documented that enslaved women were punished by having their head shaved or having their head branded in ways that would make their hair grow in clumps or uneven. We also know that enslaved women were told that they needed to cover their heads in order to seem less attractive, so that white males would not try to engage in sexual relationships with them. We know that that was rape, right? There's something that would have done, what Black women that were enslaved could have done to stop those kind of relationships from happening. But these were some of the things that were held against women. And it's all because hair is seen as women's crowning glory, right? That hair is something that in our society and throughout the world, we're socialized to think about hair as tied to women's beauty. And if Black women's hair does not grow in ways that is seen as beautiful in a Euro-American connotation, what does this mean for Black women? So because our hair grows up and out as opposed to down and long, Black women are oftentimes face discrimination because of their hair. Next slide. So our book is broken down into 8 chapters. Well, really 9 because we have an introduction. So it is a substantial book, but I think it's a great read. What about you, Danielle? Do you want to add anything?
I think so. I'm gonna wait until we get through the chapters.
Okay, so keep going. So the Crown Act is where I kind of left off with, right, of Black women being discriminated against their hair. And really, right, not just Black women, but those with Afro-textured hair. And Afro-textured hair is hair that grows that is curly or coily and kinky, hair that requires a lot of moisture and limited styling practices in order for it to grow. And because of Afro-textured hair, the way that it grows out of the scalp and the kind of maintenance that it needs in order to be healthy and to grow, people with Afro-textured hair usually wear protective hairstyles. So this woman in this photo is wearing braids. My hair is in locks. And these are 2 protective styles that enable your hair to maintain moisture and not to have to be manipulated daily or in extensive ways. Other protective hairstyles are wigs or buns and other kinds of twist outs and other things like this. But what the Crown Act seeks to do is stop people with Afro-textured hair from being discriminated against by wearing protective styling, because that's what's best for their hair, the way that their hair grows. And so you're probably familiar with a myriad of stories. We saw particularly a lot of them around 2019 of school-age children that were being asked to leave school and not come back until their hair was done differently, or children that had their hair cut because it didn't conform to school policies and codes. This has also happened to Black women who have been fired from employment because of their styles that they wore their hair in is not a way that the company saw it as being a professional look. And what the Crown Act seeks to do is say that these forms of discrimination are based on race. So it's adding on to what we know about civil rights policies. The Crown Act was a piece of legislation that was started by Senator Holly now I can't think of her last name. I'm doing this without notes. Holly Mitchell in California, who introduced the Crown Act and then later helped to build the Crown Coalition. The Crown Act now has has been enacted in over 20 state houses and city councils nationwide. It's also making its way through the federal government. And we take the Crown Act as a starting point for our book to explain why Black women's hair in particular needs kind of federal protection, and it helps us to think about grounding why hair is a political tool and something that's political for Black women. Next slide. So in the first part of the book, I wrote the first part, Danielle wrote the end, and we, I think, collaborated on a chapter in the middle. And so the front part of the book is an interpretivist study, and where I talk with Black women, political elites, and voters to understand the meaning and significance of hair for them. And in a chapter 3, where we do interviews with Black women, Black women elected officials and candidates, these are some themes that come out, that they're all thinking about hair and they note that hair matters, but they just say that it matters in different ways. So these are some of the thematic frames that we find in this chapter. Next slide, please. So these next 2 slides are direct quotes from our participants. This is a quote from Joya Mohammed. And as a disclaimer, Danielle and I have changed all of the names and replaced them with pseudonyms, enabled to give our participants a sense of anonymity and to also just have this Black feminist ethic of how we present our data. So Joya Mohammed is a Missouri state legislator who converted to the Nation of Islam in her 20s and used to wear a hijab to the state house. When I met with her to do this interview in 2015, she had just decided to stop wearing the hijab. And I asked her on our first time on our interview to bring with her for her interview, her campaign materials. So when we're sitting down at this coffee shop in the Central West End in St. Louis, she shares with me why she decided not to wear the hijab and how she changed up her appearance for these new promotional materials for her campaign to run for re-election. So this is what she says to me. Your image is nonverbal. You are talking to people even when you're not talking, and they're going to listen to you. Well, not literally listen to you, but listen to you and pay attention to you based on your appearance. They prejudge you way before you open your mouth. So you have to have this mainstream image, so to speak. A lot of African Americans are not confident in their own skin, and they want to be accepted. So they change their dialect when they're around non-African Americans, they posture their hair, and they allow for people, not all Black folks, but many, allow people to define who they are versus them defining themselves. This is troubling because what was defined as beauty within the African American community with the first 50 elected officials, you almost had to look like a white person. So I put these quotes together, right? So in the middle, she's, kind of talking through in some ways that aren't necessarily connected to the question that I asked her. But it's interesting for our purpose, right, that she is sharing that she decides to change up her look because people are paying attention to you and they're using your look as a political heuristic. And the work that Danielle does in the back end of the book will really talk to this more. And so while she didn't stop wearing her hijab because of the image issue, it was on her mind, right? She actually stopped wearing it because it was breaking off her hair around where the material of the hijab was rubbing against her hair, her hairline. But she recognizes the difference, right, in how people thought about her when she took it off. But then conversely, right, she says, well, some Black people just aren't comfortable with their own skin and they're trying to fit into mainstream America. And in some ways, right, we could say that she might have done the same thing by not wearing the hijab and doing these new headshots that look more mainstream. The next slide, please. And the last quote that I'll share with you today is from Ada Appleton. And this is a really, for me, a very personal quote because this was the interview that really sparked in my mind, this is a book project and not a bunch of journal articles. So Ada Appleton is a state delegate in the Maryland state legislature. And when I first started talking to her, she was deciding to run for office. And she and I are about 4 years apart. And so I was kind of looking up to her as an aspirational peer. She had a lawyer in a very prominent DC law firm. She's on the outside, she had it all, right? She had the house, the kids, the husband, all the things. And she had natural hair. And I was contemplating at the time whether I should go natural or not. And she was telling me, oh yeah, girl, just do it, right? Like people, if that's their issue, let them deal with it. And so talking to her really helped to frame how this is a political thing, but not just for her, but also for me in my own academic career. So I asking her how she decided, or like kind of the reception that she received when she decided to run for office. So this is her first quote. It wasn't just around kitchen tables. Instead, it was me walking down the hall at my job. And like there were 3 women yoking me up, like, yo, come here, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, yes. And they were literally like, you can't run for office with your hair all over your head like that. And I was like, what? What do you mean? So in this quote, right, Ada Appleton is really clear on what these women at her law firm were doing, right? These senior Black women who wanted to help her, wanted to support her, and they were giving her what they thought was helpful advice and saying, you can't run for office with natural hair. You need to do something else to your hair. And she laughed it off and joked about it. And then later on, she said about 2 weeks later, she came back and recruited them to help her with their campaign because they were so invested, right, in thinking about her hair that maybe that they would be invested enough to help pass out campaign materials, to give donations, to host fundraising activities. So later on in our interview, we're at our kitchen table and I'm asking her about her hair and how she's deciding to wear it on the campaign trail. And she goes to their bathroom and comes back with a blow dryer. And she says, this is a blow dryer, you need it, right? This is serious business, the decision to remain natural on the campaign trail. But I saw how I did after a blowout. And a blowout is when you straighten your hair with heat, the blow dryer. There are a little resistance, but then it's one thing that you have to make a decision. Is this a battle that I really want to fight, right? And for me, natural hair, it's not necessary. It's not a political statement, to a certain extent, like this is just my hair. And so for Ada Appleton, she just thought, this is other people's issues, right? People think that I can't run and win in this district with straight hair. So I'll blow my hair out. I'll keep my hair in its natural state, but I will straighten it temporarily. And then she did well when she did that. And so she figured I'll do this now just to get elected. And then once elected, she does whatever she wants to her hair. Her constituents know her now. She's been a known entity in Maryland politics. So it's not as big of an issue. Next slide. You want to take this one, Danielle?
Yes. So this was one of the chapters that we got to collaborate really closely on. We did a focus group with members of the Black Women's Political Action Committee of Texas. And we did a focus group with folks actually in Dallas. And so big shout out to Tracy Scott with the Black Women's PAC. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to do this. What we were doing here is, again, using interpretivist methods to kind of like understand, get a holistic and a contextual view of like how Black women politicians in particular, so folks who are politicians, folks who have run for office, folks who are thinking about office, like what significance do they assign, to hair and skin tone? And we had 12 participants, and our participants varied in age, offices held, offices sought. They primarily identified as Democrats. And I think, one of the most interesting things about this focus group that we held was, one, it was 12 participants. And so typically you want to do like 5 to 7. And so at some point we were like, how are we going to like moderate this conversation? But we did it. But I think for me, what was really interesting was just seeing like the group conversation come alive, right? One of the things in political science we don't really do is like focus groups. Part of that is because they're so expensive, they take a long time. It takes a long time to transcribe these conversations. It takes a long time to recruit people. And so political scientists often don't do focus groups. But what this chapter did was it added a layer of nuance by introducing this group dynamic so that participants who were talking about something could really build off each other's energy. And if one person wanted to show vulnerability, they could build off another person showing vulnerability, or they could, if they wanted to show strength, they could build off another person who wanted to show strength. And so the thing about focus groups is that it allows people to share things with the interviewer that they might not share in a one-on-one conversation where it's just you, the interviewee, and the recorder. Nadia, do you want to add?
And so we are the first and only study in political science to do focus groups with Black women elected officials. So again, we thank Tracy for the opportunity. And as part of this, as engaged scholars, we give back to the Black Women's PAC. So we're not extracting information from them, but we have a relationship with the Black Women's PAC where we share our findings and help the political elites to basically, we help to translate political science research to the things that political elites could actually use, right? Yeah, so Danielle, that's go to the next slide. So what we found, okay.
Go ahead.
So what we found in this chapter was, again, much more the nuance that Danielle is started talking to us about. That these are some of the thematic frames that we found from this chapter that came through for us. I think most surprising, what we did not necessarily anticipate, was the huge generational divide and split that we saw in the room, right? And the millennial women, the women that were born from 1981 to 1994, had much different experiences and wanted to present themselves in ways that the older members did not necessarily think they should. But the older members were supportive of these women. They saw themselves as counseling them on looks that would be, much more palatable to voters. But the young women were really trying to push back against this. In hindsight, right? I guess we would have, again, we could have broken up the focus groups into different groups. We would have done an all millennial focus group. But I think, right, and one of the themes throughout the book are just the changing and shifting ways in which the politics of appearance show up for Black women. And it doesn't go away, it just changes shapes, right? And so in some questions I've done a couple of these book talks, and then some of the questions I get are, do we think that this will go away, right? And that Black women will just be able to present themselves however they want? And I think the answer is no, right? There will still be these kind of shifting and policing norms within Black communities that will dictate what an acceptable style is for Black women. And next slide.
Okay, so this is heading towards some of the chapters that I wrote for the book. This is where we make kind of an epistemological shift. And so the first half of the book, we're using an interpretivist lens, and we are recognizing that knowledge is not objective, science is not objective, everything is an interpretation of something, right? You as a researcher, you are filtering something like through your head. You're receiving this data and you're interpreting it and you're delivering it to people. But I was trained as a positivist, and a whole different set of assumptions go into those approaches, like the idea that you can formulate an objective hypothesis about the world, the idea that you can test that hypothesis and have some evidence to hold up or disconfirm that hypothesis. And so in the second half of the book, we're building on what we found in the first half, that Black women elites assign meaning to the politics of hair, the politics of skin tone. And we're taking a departure from political science, as Nadia said, by using a real intersectional framework, right? So traditionally, political scientists would be like, why are you even looking at this? Why does this even matter? Well, as you can see, it does matter. Elites themselves say that it matters. And so what we're doing is we're building on those conversations and funneling that into experimental designs where we ask Black voters or participants that we recruited from survey panels to assess hypothetical Black women candidates. And so in the book, we ran 2 experiments, both of which we manipulated the appearance of one Black woman candidate, skin tone and hairstyle. And we basically just asked Black respondents, how would you rate this candidate on a number of issues? How warm do you feel about this candidate? Would you vote for this candidate? Do you think that this candidate is going to win? And so this is a sample of what our participants saw. So if you get the book, you'll see who played the candidates in our experiment. But because this is the internet and the internet, I'm not gonna show their photos here, but you have to get the book and then you can see who played our candidates. But this is an example of one of the mock-ups from our study. We featured 2 Black women running against each other in a Democratic runoff. And part of the motivation for this was, one, everybody's always talking about how Black women, they're the backbone of the Democratic Party. Black women tend to run as Democratic candidates. And so our thinking was, okay, it's pretty realistic to imagine a scenario in which Black voters might be presented with two Black women who are competing against each other in a primary and who might look different. And what we're interested in is raising the salience of like how they look by having these two Black women candidates. And I'm thinking of Weaver's work on skin tone and evaluation of Black candidates. And basically just trying to see like, what do Black voters think of these Black women candidates? What we found was that when two Black women who vary in appearances run against each other, Black voters make inferences about both candidates. And so just changing the appearance of one candidate pushed Black voters to make a whole different set of assessments about her opponent when we only change the appearance of one candidate. And in particular, when we break up the results by gender, what we found was that Black women may be less likely to believe that a candidate with lighter skin and curly hair will win, relative to a candidate with lighter skin and straight hair. And so the comparison there is hairstyle. The difference between these two candidates, or the presentation of the candidate that we manipulated, is hairstyle. And what we found for Black men was that Black men are more likely to say that a candidate with darker skin and straight hair is the likely winner relative to a lighter skinned opponent with straight hair. And so here, the difference is skin tone, right? So Black women may be less likely to say that a candidate with lighter skin and curly hair will win. Curly hair candidate is penalized relative to a candidate with lighter skin and straight hair. Black men are more likely to say that a candidate with darker skin and straight hair is the likely winner relative to a lighter skinned opponent with straight hair. Now in the book, we talk more about possible reasons for this, but we broke up our data like this in particular because we're not just pursuing, intersectionality as like this thought exercise or like, this like novelty, the way that people talk about it. People often say, oh, when you're doing an intersectional analysis, you just interact the race and the gender variable, bump, 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 it's done, right? So we're not really comparing Black women against Black men voters. What we're doing is we're looking at how Black women as a group, a distinct group, evaluate these candidates, how Black men as a distinct group evaluate these candidates. That is an actual intersectional approach. And in the book, we offer explanations for why might that be the case. What is it about like those social locations that lead these participants to evaluate these candidates the way they do? Nadia, do you want to add anything? Okay. So in the next chapter, we asked, is there a Black woman candidate prototype? And what we're doing here is we're building on the literature on colorism, and we're trying to think like, okay, colorism exists. Is it the case that the pool of Black women who even run for office, is it the case that they're lighter skin on average? And what happens to these candidates in the end? And so we collected all Black women who ran, I think it was, I want to say 2018, who were listed on the Black Women in Politics website. We collected their names, and we got a whole crew of research assistants to help us with this, because we wanted their names, we wanted the office they pursued, we wanted locations, we wanted their electoral outcomes, and then we also collected their photos, because we thought, let's do a visual analysis to think about if there's any kind of like bias in the pool of candidates. Are they experiencing any sort of bias in like what happens to their electoral outcomes? So we collected headshots so we could code skin tone and hairstyle. And when it came to skin tone, we used the Massey and Martin skin color scale. And we can talk about whether this is even useful, issues with measuring skin tone. But we used a team of coders, and looking at the headshots of everybody who ran in 2018, or Black women who ran in 2018, we assigned values based on the scale to their headshots, because again, we want to see, is there like a bias in favor of lighter skinned candidates in the pool of Black women who ran in 2018. And so we collected 664 photos. What we found was that the average Massey and Martin rating, again, we can talk more about some of the issues with this scale. What we found was that the average rating was 429 on the scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is the lightest end, 10 is the darkest end. The average was 429, so right in here. So on average, the pool of candidates, the headshots that we collected, again, these are headshots that candidates themselves have put online. So that's, we can talk more about, how candidates have decided to present themselves on the internet. it skews relatively light. When it comes to hairstyles, what we found was that straight and curly styles are roughly evenly distributed at the state and congressional level, but braids and locks tend to be concentrated at the local level. And so we did an analysis of skin tone, hairstyles, as well as electoral outcomes. What happens to these candidates by skin tone? What happens to these candidates by hairstyle? And then what happens when we look at skin tone and hairstyle? So you'll have to get the book to find out what happens. But Nadia, do you want to add anything?
No, I think we got to keep moving in interest of time.
All right, well, that's it.
That's perfect.
So Ashton, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you both for that presentation. I think that the info that you presented was really, really interesting. I think that in this kind of day, the research that you're doing is very top of mind for especially people of color. And so I have a question, and that for me is, I think in the book you talked a lot about, I think you were polling and surveying Black voters, is that correct? What do you see, if anything, or if you've looked at it, as a gap between kind of what Black women candidates have as their personal identity and personal characteristics that are important to them, the gap between what Black voters and maybe even white voters expect to see from them, and how have you seen them bridging that gap?
Could I just piggyback on that question too? And why did you not look at white voters?
Yeah, so this was a very deliberate choice that we made to only look at Black voters and to only look at Black women. Notice in the chat, in the Q&A, there's a question, did we look at Black men? So no, we only looked at Black women because of the social historical reasonings that I kind of shared up front about how we're socialized, how Black women's hair is seen in society and how it's socialized. So we looked at Black voters to stimulate majority-minority districts where most Black women run and win elections. We do know that Black women are winning and having some success in non-majority minority districts, but this is the likely place where we'll see these kind of matchups, right? That the districts so we tried to create a hypothetical experience that would mirror real life as much as possible.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, like there's a larger story that we didn't really talk about during the talk, but I think this is an excellent question and a really great place to talk about it. There's enough on what white people think about Black voters and Black people. In political science, the dominant approach to studying like racism is how are white people affected by the presence of these racial others, right? And it's dehumanizing, and it's time for political science to make a shift. And so when Nadia says that was a very deliberate decision, it was a very deliberate decision. This is not going to be a story about like how white voters might exoticize like Black women candidates, or like how they might channel their implicit bias to evaluate Black women candidates. This is a story about Black women elites and how Black voters evaluate Black women elites, theorizing from the actual narrative of Black women elites themselves that we talk about in the first half of the book.
Got it. Thank you. And then we did have a question up earlier in the chat asking where specifically that these stats that you're touching on are coming from.
So I think, Danielle, that was in the initial part where you started talking about some of when you rolled into your part of the book. So very beginning.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was just in terms of kind of the stats that you were talking about and looking at, where did you get those stats from, and what are those based on?
Yes, so I think the question might be referring to the statistics about the headshots. And so we're just kind of previewing, so it's in the book, it's in one of the tables in the book, but we're just kind of previewing what we found in our analysis of 664 headshots of candidates who ran in 2018. I think it was 2018.
And Danielle, could you say a little more about the samples that you had and how you put this together?
Sure. So this, as far as the headshots go, that was a nationwide sample. So one of the practical constraints about studying non-white politicians generally in political science is that it's not like you can just go and like download a list from some government bureaucracy that like collects the demographics of candidates. And so we had to think about like, okay, if we want to analyze the pool of Black women candidates, where could we get that information? Like, it didn't make sense for us to just like sit down and collect all that data ourselves, because that takes years. And like, there are collectives set up, like groups of scholars who act as cooperatives to collect that information for each other to use. And so we used the Black Women in Politics website. Someone else had already collected that data. And so we just generated a whole list of candidates from that website. And so that's our universe, if you will.
And I would like to just jump in before we go back to the more general questions. You guys were so disciplined. You got done in a very short period of time. So this is going to leave us more time for questions. But I can't resist exercising the prerogative a little bit of the chair here. You talked about generational differences. You didn't elaborate too much on that. Of course, I'm interested, are there regional differences that you discovered? I mean, does this vary from different regions of the US, what your findings are? You touched a little bit on the gender dimension of this, but you really didn't elaborate that much on the difference between men and women and how they look at the hairstyle and skin tone. And, you know, I have one more, I guess maybe sort of bombshell question. I'm going to just throw them all out on the table here for you to think about. You know, I'm more of a scholar of comparative politics. You know, I spent a lot of my life in France, you know, in particular in Europe, and, you know, I see these things through a slightly different lens. So I'm just curious if you have thought at all about how this might vary from one society to another, you know, with the French or the British or the Canadians, you know, would they see this differently than Americans would? And, you know, again, coming from my French bias, why should this matter? I mean, why should we be even looking at people's skin tone and hairstyle? You know, isn't that somehow in itself prejudicial and discriminatory?
Sure. So I'll take the bombshell question first and then work my way backwards. So why this matters is because if groups of people are not elected to politics, then we don't have a democracy that's representative of a body as whole, right? And we know that Black women have different political experiences based on what they look like. Some voters won't vote for them because they hold presidential views of them based on their skin tone and hair type. We also know from research that women with different looks have had different legislative experiences. Some have openly people that don't want to work with them because of what they look like and have said so very upfront and plainly. And so what this means is that there are complicating factors for Black women politicians. And I'm not saying that there aren't complicating factors for others, but our focus here is on Black women. But what's clear is that some people will not be elected. And then when they are, they will face challenges and sometimes opportunities based on what they look like. So if we care about a healthy democracy, it means that everyone should have a shot at getting a seat at the legislative table. So that's the so what answer. The question about varying from other regions and contexts, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that Danielle and I were really clear to do is really ground this in the American experience. And we know that, and there are people in the book that are, that we've spoke to that have varying backgrounds of Americanness, quote unquote, right? People with different immigration status, family backgrounds, right? So folks that were from the Caribbean or from Africa, but they are read in our country because of racialization as Black, right? And whether that is their lineage as descendants of slaves in America, or that they are socialized as such, right? And they are read as Black women. And even those that have mixed race history, like our vice president, right, see themselves and are read as Black women. And so the context of how this will play out will be different, and depending on that other locations, history with race and racism, with colonialization and imperialism. But one thing is true, that colorism, preferences for hair texture in certain ways, is something that happens throughout the African diaspora, right? And we just might see it show up in different kinds of ways, but we don't make claims that you can export this study and say, oh yeah, if you were to study, Black women in Brazil, you would find the same thing, or Black women in Nigeria or in France, right? Like, because all these countries have different kind of political histories, social, political, cultural histories in which Blackness and womanhood gets read onto women's bodies. And we spend time in the second chapter kind of walking folks through this, and particularly the, enduring stereotypes that are read onto Black women's bodies as part of, our lineage through enslavement. And I think so that's really important to make a note that we can't make generalizing claims, but we're talking about one particular group. And then this regional question, so we were super excited to see about this too, because we had a hunch like you, right, that there's different kind of preferences with in regions and things that are based in kind of our different kind of cultures based in regions of the United States. So so we got at some of this in our interviews with the women in Texas and in the focus groups. I remember one of the women, I asked the question about how did she know what the look was acceptable, or what look would be acceptable. And then she just looked at me and said, oh honey, I'm Southern, right? Like I went to charm school, and I'm from Jersey. So I was like, I don't know what that means, right? But it was like a very clear, because she just kept going, right? It was like, I asked her a very dumb question, and then and no one else in the focus group even picked up on this, right? They were just like, she answered it, let's keep moving. But then when I talked to other people from different parts of the region, of the state, right? I'm sorry, of the country, that is a real legitimate question, right? And they answered it in ways that were much more nuanced and kind of indicative of their own background and culture. But the generational thing, was consistent throughout all of this, right? So even with those generational differences and the kind of, even with the geographical differences, there were still some differences in how people of different generations were viewing what was acceptable. And it was mostly that younger women were trying to, I would say, push the envelope and think about ways that wearing natural hair was acceptable. And so it wasn't this overarching, we all think it's acceptable. Sometimes it was much more pinpointed, like if I'm going to this event, or this type of hairstyle is appropriate here. But unlike the older women, they were able to say that natural hair is acceptable in some other kind of places that we didn't see older women talk about.
Just to add on your question, Jim, like, why does this matter? Should we even pay attention to this? Like, it matters because how you look influences how people treat you, and the opportunities they offer you, the doors they will open for you. I don't know if we talked a whole lot about it in the actual manuscript about like social locations, but like those were conversations that we were having like as we were like getting ready to like do one of the focus groups, or actually maybe both of the focus groups in particular. Like, the kinds of information that I can get, like interviewing different groups of people, is going to be different than the kinds of information Nadia can get interviewing different groups of people. It is what it is, right? Like, that's just how it is. And I think in political science in particular, there's reluctance to like grapple with that. Colorism and racism, this is about white supremacy. It will continue to matter as long as white supremacy continues to exist. And so this point about representative democracy, that's part of it. And this is also, we are trying to like speak to like Eurocentrism in beauty standards that come from white supremacy.
So Ashton, can you guide us through all the questions that are out there?
Yes, we definitely have quite a few questions. So for now, kind of going back to the data that you guys looked at and how that was split up, we have a question asking, did you study the impact that socioeconomic background played in these politics of appearance for Black women?
Yes. So so we tackle head-on respectability politics, which comes to us from the Jim Crow Reconstruction era, where Black Baptist club women used respectability politics as a way for racial uplift. And so simply what they did was they tried to use white Victorian modes of socialization and behavior and dress within their own communities to show to white racists that they shouldn't be racist and they shouldn't treat Black people with less dignity because they could perform the same kind of social standards as others. And this is coming from Evelyn Higginbotham's work in the early 90s. And many people have, lots of different fields, right, have replicated some of this work or kind of applied the theory. And so we take this head on to say that what we're really seeing is some of this socioeconomic status is played out in respectability politics. So it becomes a code word, right? Like, so we use it in the book, an example of using the word ghetto as a code word for people saying, oh, your hair is ghetto. But where does this come from, right? And so if the term ghetto is supposed to apply to a geographic location of economically marginalized folks, how does that get transformed onto the hairstyle of an upwardly mobile Black woman? It's because Blackness, lower income status, and politics of behavior are all kind of wrapped up in one. And so we play on this kind of terminology and how people are using shorthands and cues for what are deemed acceptable hairstyles as part of cues for social economic status. So yes, the long answer to this is yes, and we do so by interrogating respectability politics. And just real quick, right? As an example, this happened over the inauguration when Michelle Obama, right, which is beautiful. Everyone claimed, that she just really slayed during her outfit with the maroon pantsuit and the coat. It was just, the belt, all the things, right? But very quickly after the inauguration, people took to Twitter to slam other Black women and hold up Michelle Obama and saying she is the mode of respectability politics. Look, Black women, Michelle Obama slayed, and all you saw was her eyes, right? Because she had on a mask, she had on the turtleneck, right? Like it was cold, so she was in the fur-love coat, and then juxtaposed her to Black women who show more skin, right? Or perhaps seen as less chaste than she is. So these things get replayed over and over and over again. And that for us, right, is an example of how respectability politics doesn't leave our communities, right? Because they're ingrained in anti-Blackness and white supremacy that, again, are not created by Blacks, but Blacks are living within these structures, right? And internalize and use or sort of operate within this system, right? So for Blacks, right, this is the air that we breathe, the water that we live in. And so we recreate these structures, even sometimes while we're trying to push back against them by holding up someone and saying, yeah, we love what she's done and what she looks like, but in the same way, denigrating other folks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point about Michelle Obama, because I think that was huge, just how it could have been taken as a time to just uplift Black women in general. And it was kind of used as a way to pit Black women against each other. So another question that we have that I think is an important one is, did you interview any Republican Black women politicians or political candidates? And if so, was there a difference in their perception of appearance from Democrats?
Yes. So this is something that also just sticks with me. So I interviewed one Republican woman. I asked to interview several others. She was the only one who agreed. So maybe that's a story in and of itself, an article in and of itself. But this woman is running in the south side of Chicago, who will never win this district just because her views are so out of step with this district. So just to paint the story, the district that she's running in is currently held by a former Black Panther. Barack Obama ran in that district and lost, right? So she is not going to win. But she's been running in this district for years, I think maybe even a decade now. And when I spoke with her and I asked her about her hair, she did several things. One, she connected African Americans and Democrats in our interview, so she would use the terms interchangeably. And so in some ways, it was kind of difficult for me to keep up with, is she really talking about Black folks or is she talking about Democrats? The other thing she did was she said that she was intentional in some ways about not getting her hair done. One, because it's so expensive. So the hairstyle that she had a relaxer, her hair was straightened through chemicals. It was about $80 to $150 to get done every 4 weeks, every 4 to 6 weeks. And she says she couldn't afford that. And she was intentional in some ways about not getting her hair done because Democrats have come under fire for having expensive haircuts. So think about John Edwards or AOC. And she didn't want Republicans to think that she was abusing finances, right? So that we're using campaign finances to get her hair done. And she said, like, my hair looks bad, but guess what? Republicans don't care. They don't know that my hair looks bad. And so, like, sidebar, her hair did look bad, right? Like, as a Black woman, I was like, ooh, you showed up to your fundraising event like this? But her hair did not look good. And she hadn't had it done in a very long time because she said it was really expensive. And she was concerned that Republicans would think that she was abusing the campaign finances to get her hair done. And then lastly, she says to me in this interview that for her, this isn't so much of an issue running as a Republican because for Democrats, and particularly she's using Democrats and Blacks interchangeably, that Black folks look at people to see their value, right? So you have to look a certain way to be seen as an authority or to be seen as a legitimate candidate. And she repeats over and over again, we were trained that we have to look our best and be our best. We have to look our best and be our best. And she's telling this to me, right, as a Black woman without explaining this. So for those who aren't familiar with Black vernacular, this is an adage that Black parents tell their children, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far as how white people get, right? Just because of racism, you're behind the 8 ball. And part of this is also looking the part. And she said, for Black people, like, I will never get in the door because I can't look the way that they want me to look. I can't afford to do this.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting juxtaposition there. And unfortunately, we are running low on time. So we might be able to sneak one last question in. I think we had a lot of questions just kind of asking more about just the breakdown of data and the different things that were looked at. And I think that it's safe to say that most of that information can be found in your book. So to close it out, I would say probably, guys, everyone buy the book and check it out for yourself, because I think that we've gotten a lot of great info. But just finally, we have a question from Neil Foley, who works at SMU in the Department of History. And his question was, as Danielle points out, political science scholars who focus on issues of race often address how non-white groups affect whites. And your intersectional work on race and colorism would be embraced by sociologists. Does this kind of intersectional study find a welcome audience and reception in political science, as it does in sociology, or not? What has your experience been throughout your research?
Now this is, I think Danielle and I are both laughing because we're like, no. Political science is like, what is this in some regards, right? Like we are upsetting the apple cart by, like, yeah, exactly. Like we're not asking about how white people think about Black women, right? And really, like, a lot of literature that we're drawing from is sociology, it's anthropology, women's studies, AFAM. It's not, necessarily political science. We do like the cursory overview of, this is how we know people think about voting, and this is how we know candidates think about running for office. But for the most part, it's a deep dive into the cultural political reasons of how Black women are experiencing politics.
No. So yes, Nadia is right. We did have to pull a lot from other disciplines. I think this question, Neil, thanks so much for asking. Like, this is a bigger question that people of color broadly in political science, and to varying degrees, face when they study people of color, when they theorize about racism, when they theorize about structures of power. It's always, how is this political science, and what do white voters think? And so, by producing this book, we are making deliberate choices about, like, who we decided to recruit, who we decided to focus on. But it's also, like, to me, part of this is, kind of an affront to the discipline. Like, scholars who study this stuff should just study this stuff and do their own thing.
Well, I would just want to interject at the end. Thank you both for this absolutely fascinating presentation. And I think Ashton made the operative point, which is everybody has to go out now and get the book. and look at it. I appreciate that last comment about how political science needs to grow up, get over it, and really start looking at what's happening in the world. So thank you both very, very much. Really great presentation. Ashton, do you have any final comments?
Really just to echo what you said, thank you both. I like I've said all night, I think that this is really important research, and I think the fact that it isn't necessarily what people are used to and what people expect as far as political science goes, I think that makes it even more important. And so I hope that everyone feels very enlightened. Thank you all for coming tonight. Big thank you to Danielle and Nadia and Professor Hollifield for attending. I think this was a great program, so thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Danielle. So great to see you. Nadia, thank you. Jim, great for our commentator, and Ashton, you're a great moderator. So thank you all, and we hope to see you at future events.
And Bora, this will be online and available eventually. People can go
Yes.
back and watch the program again. Yeah.
Yes. So we'll have it posted by next week.
Okay.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.